Well, welcome back, folks. Another update on the Ford 8N project. I have completed the valve job, as you can see there, I think. All new valves all the way across, cleaned everything up. The piston tops have been cleaned, of course. The top of the block's been cleaned. The manifold mounts has been cleaned. You can see the nice shiny valves right there along the top. The pieces of paper towel, 1, 2, 3, 4, you see in the bottom of the valve chamber, those are drain backs for oil into the lower sump of the engine, and I just plugged those to keep any debris that might find its way back into the pan of the engine until I can get it all closed up. So those are just to plug up those drain holes. Other than that, the valve train is done. Over here in the corner where I'm pointing to is where the governor usually sits. I did pull the governor out, and I'm doing a minor rebuild, not a full rebuild, but partial, as well as painting the housing, and that'll be the subject of another video. We're not going to cover the governor today. We're going to talk a little bit more detail about the valves though. And this was quite a project, I have to say. For those of you that have been with me for a while, particularly on my motorcycle projects, you're aware I've done a lot of different wrenching, a lot of different engines. I've done valve jobs, excuse me, everything from 4-cylinder, double overhead cam Japanese bikes down to little single-cylinder 50cc 2-strokes. Well, I didn't do a valve job on the 2-strokes, but I've worked on all those different engines over the years. This one really challenged me to get the valves out. It wasn't the valve job itself that was so complicated. It was getting those valves out. And those are a cartridge-style valve. And in other words, those are pre-assembled on the bench, and then they're dropped into place and retained by little retainer clips. And I'll do a close-up shot of that in a minute. So the idea is you push those in, or drop them in, and then you push them down with a tool. I used this tire iron here, and the idea is you go through, in this case it would be an exhaust port, and you push that valve assembly down, and then you slide that little retainer in and hold the valve assembly in place. For the intake valves, that didn't work. This was too big to get through the intake port, so I just took an old screwdriver and I ground it like that, which is what I had read online was advised. You can see I ground this curve to it. Then you could put that through the port, push down on the top of the valve against the spring tension, and then put the retainer in. That's the theory. Well, it wasn't putting them together or putting them back in that was so much the challenge. It was getting the old ones out, and that was a fight. And to get the old ones out is really the reverse process. You go in, you're supposed to push down on the top of the valve body, pull the retainer, and then the valve comes out the top. Sure, it doesn't exactly work that way. In fact, it didn't work that way well at all for me, which again I've discovered is pretty common. As I said before, I don't think this engine has ever had the head off before, and I don't think it's ever had any work done outside of maybe adjustment of the valves. So those have been in there for 75 years. What I ran into is I couldn't push the valves down I couldn't push them down at all in most cases. 2 of them I could, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But I couldn't push them down to relieve the tension on that keeper so I could pop the keeper out on most of the valves. Cylinder number 1, the one furthest to the right, I could just barely push down the valve guide body far enough that I could pull that keeper out with a pair of pliers on cylinder 1. Cylinder 2, it didn't work that way at all. There's number 2, 3, and 4, it didn't work that way at all. What I'd read online, the next thing you were supposed to try, if that didn't work because they get carbon in on those bores where the valves fit down into, is to use a valve compressor, and you compress this valve body up like this against the spring tension. You pull the keepers off the bottom of the valves, and then you can push the valves out the top, and then you can either drive the remainder of the valve assembly, which basically is the valve guide, either up or down. Well, that didn't work so well either. So what happened there, and now I'm working on cylinder 2. I took my spring compressor, my little simple spring compressor that would fit up something like that up underneath the valve, and then of course I'd spin this down against the top of the valve. The idea was to compress the spring, pull the keepers, pull the valve out, etc. One of them, it was the intake on number 2, worked that way. On number 2 exhaust port, which is right here, the spring gave me trouble and I broke the ear off of my little arm here on the spring compressor. Well, I thought, okay, I'll switch to the backup because I had a second one right here, and that broke. So now I had a broken spring compressor and no way of getting the rest of the valves out. So I thought about this a little bit, sat back again like I typically would do, and thought, okay, what am I going to do next? And I ultimately resorted to a bit of force, frankly. What I ended up doing is I couldn't even, maneuver the valves in most cases enough to pull those keepers out. So I just got a pair of big vice grips, locking mole grip type pliers, and I went in there and clamped down on those keepers and just pulled them out. I bent them in the process, but that was fine. I didn't care because I was going to replace them all anyway, and just pulled the keepers out and bent them in the process of the remaining valves. The valves still wouldn't move, the valve body still wouldn't move in the bore, so what I ended up doing then, and I thought, enough of this noise, I got on my Dremel and just cut the valve springs in pieces. Again, I was going to replace them anyway, and I had this well draped so that there was going to be no metal shavings are going to get into the lower part of the engine. I had it draped with fabric cloths and cut the springs into pieces, took the springs out. Then I could push the valves up far enough without a spring compressor, and because there's no valve springs, pull the keepers that are retained on the bottom, pull the valves out the top. Then I drove the valve guide bodies down this way into the chamber with a brass drift and a brass hammer. Then I had all the valves removed. Everything I just shared with you took me the better part of a morning to wrestle through each step, and it wasn't much fun at all, but we did get there. Then I ran a brake hone, a fine shoot brake hone through the bores of each of the valve, for each of the valve bodies, just cleaned them up because they were full of carbon, especially on the exhaust side. Got them nice and clean, flushed them out good, of course. And then when it came time to install the new valves that you see here, it went together fine. I just, literally the way it was supposed to, I reached through with those hook tools, pushed down against spring tension and slid the keeper in, released the tension with the hook, and they were fine. Then of course I had to go through and readjust the lash on all of those valves. Installing the valves themselves probably took me half an hour, 40 minutes maybe. Adjusting the lash, because I had to bring each cylinder top dead center so that each pair of valves wasn't under compression, and then check and adjust the valve lash. And then I went back through a second time and did it again, just double check my settings. That probably took me 2 to 3 hours, frankly, to do all of that, because I'd never done it before in this kind of engine. So bottom line, to put the valves in and adjust the lash, probably a better part of a half a day or so, but it's done. And they're all set appropriately. I've checked them twice. I'll probably check them again before it's all over. Checking them doesn't take very long. It's the adjusting that takes the time, but we got her done finally. So allow me to put a photo up here briefly of the valve assemblies, these cartridges, before I put them in the block, just so you can see what they look like before they were installed. And then we're going to zoom in here for a little closer shot, because there's a couple other things I want to talk about. These are the keepers right here I'm pointing to. Each valve assembly has a keeper, and that slides up in underneath like that and holds this assembly in place. So you've got one keeper for each of the valves. Those are all new. So the springs, the valves, everything but the lifters. That's the lifter right here. So you got a lifter at the bottom of each valve. This one you can't see because it's retracted into the block. The cam rides underneath like this and spins and activates the lifters, of course. It pushes up the valve. But so these are the keepers that I had to, from like here back, I had to just yank out using a pair of vice grips or mole grips. Take note of these springs and how they're wound. Now, this is one of the original springs. I know I got a shadow there, but you're just going to have to bear with me on this. This is one of the valves. In fact, I think it was this cylinder right here. I think it was a number 1 exhaust. So this is the first one I took out that I was able to get out intact. But this valve, you'll notice how this valve spring is positioned, and it's more tightly wound at this end than it is at this end, which is not uncommon on valve springs. In fact, it's very common. And it's sat like this. And notice that the tightly wound coils, there's 2 or 3 of them, are at the bottom as a valve sits like this. Everything I read on this engine, and the service manuals were not specific and didn't talk about this, but everything I've read from other people that have worked on these engines over the years, some real old timers that are very familiar with these engines, said the valve spring should be, the tightly wound end right here should be at this end, not this end. In other words, this should be up against the valve guide. And that's what this is right here. This section is the valve guide. And it was opposite in this engine when I took it apart. And again, I still don't think this engine has ever had the valves on. Maybe. It just didn't look like it had ever been apart before. A little confused by that. But this is the way all 8 of these valves had the tightly wound coils at the bottom and the looser end at the top. The reverse of what everybody said to do. And I couldn't find anything in any of the service manuals that spoke to this at all. Now, my experience in other engines, and I have worked on a lot of 4-strokes, mostly motorcycles and small engines, lawnmowers, that kind of thing. I've always put, and even some of the service manuals would talk about putting the tighter coil towards the head, because most of those are overhead valve engines, and the less tightly wound coil will go against the end of the unit where it's moving. So in other words, this is the end of the valve that gets pushed up and compressed this way. It gets compressed this way. The idea is the mass, that would be this, where the tightly wound spring is, coils, you don't want to push all that mass. You want the mass up here and less mass down here. And it's easier on the valve train. And that's the way I've always done it. I don't remember when I had auto mechanics many years ago, we even talked about it. Maybe we did, but again, that was in the early 70s when I had auto mechanics, and I don't remember us talking about it. But I've never seen this assembly done this way, and it's not in the service manuals, and everyone that's worked on these engines said you'd have a reverse pattern for the spring. So the new ones, these, I put in the way I was advised to put them in, and it's really commonly understood that this is the way to do it, which matches my experience on other engines, not on this engine. So the only 2 things I can come up with, number 1 is, one would be that someone did do a valve job and got these springs reversed. That would be 1. Or number 2, Ford, when the engine was built, put them in upside down. They were all the same. They weren't mismatched. Could be, I suppose, I don't know, but I went with the common wisdom that I could find, and I did a lot of reading, a lot of research, multiple service manuals, and everything I could find directed to install the valves this way, with the looser end here at this end of the assembly, and the tighter coils here. So that's how these were put together. I don't think, frankly, on a low RPM, low compression, under stressed engine like this, it's probably going to make a lot of difference in reality. I mean, it's not a race engine. Probably won't make a lot of difference. But I went ahead and put it together based on common wisdom that's out there these days. And if I got it wrong, then I guess so be it. But This is the way they came out, and this is the way I put them in, so they're all the same. So I want to share that with you, and let's do a top-down view. I'll reposition the camera, and we'll look at the top of the engine, looking down at the pistons before we move on, and we'll talk a little bit about the cylinder head. There's not a whole lot to talk about. I did want to give you a view of the top of the engine. Of course, it's all been cleaned. You can see the valves, and I had them numbered cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4. The reason that was done is when I cut the valve seats, I put the guides in and used the pilot to cut the valve seats, and I wanted to put the pilot that was used for that particular valve seat back in the same spot, and that's why they're numbered. We'll come back and talk about cutting the valve seats in just a minute, but you can see the top of the engine, and it's nice and clean, and it's really ready to go back together when I get around to that step. As I was preparing to do the valve work, I had to determine whether I was going to have to lap the valves, grind the valves, cut new valve seats, how I was going to approach the problem. Grinding a valve seats isn't done today as often as it used to be. In lapping in the new valves to the old seats would have worked probably on a couple of the valves because the seats were in pretty good condition, but I had one cylinder, and I think it was number 2, if I recall. Had some pitting, some fairly significant pitting in the valve seat, and lapping wasn't going to work, so I knew I was going to have to do something different. So again, I did research and thought through my options, and what I ultimately did is I bought this New Way valve seat cutting system. New Way's been around for decades. I think they started in the early 1950s. They're a US-based company, and in fact they are located only like 125 miles away from me in the same state. And they make their own tooling, and it's all American-made stuff. A little pricey, but they're well known in the industry and the trade, and they supply valve seat cutting tools to race teams, to professional mechanics, to everybody. Very, very well known. And everything I read said if you want to do it right, if you need to cut some of your valve seats in your tractor, go with New Way. So I called them. They had a kit put together specifically for the 8N, and they sent me the kit, and I had it within 24 hours or so. And this is what the kit looked like. Of course, you have a little instruction booklet here, or manual. It came with it. And then here's the actual cutters. This is a 45-degree cutter right here, and this is a combination 30 and 60-degree cutter. Now, the Ford 8N originally came with a 45-degree valve seat. That being this angle like this, you know, your valve sits down into. Most modern engines now use a three different degree valve seat angle cut, and that is 45, which is where the valve sits against, then a 30 and a 60. And the idea is to create a bit of a, let me get my hand in here, a bit of a flow for the fuel air mixture or exhaust, whether it's coming or going. So I used the 3-angle system. I could have gotten by with just a 45-degree, but while I was doing it, I just ordered the extra cutter with the 30 and the 60, and you reverse it. So one side it's 30, you flip it over, and the other side is 60. So this is, I believe, the 30, this is the 60 here. So you put it in like this, or you put it in, let me get this down, like this, or like this. This is the T-handle that just fits over the top, like that. And then you have a screwdriver for changing the cutter blades. These blades are replaceable right here. So well, it's not even a screwdriver, it's a small Allen tool, and then you have a brush for cleaning out the cutter tool themselves, the teeth. And then you have the pilots. Now, they sent 2 different pilots. The pilot goes down into the valve guide. Again, remember, I used new valve guides or installed new valve guides. That's why I needed them numbered, so that when I put a new valve guide in and I ground that particular seat to that valve. I numbered it so I knew which one went where. They send a standard size pilot. These are tapered, so when you put them into the valve seat and you twist it, it tightens in. And then this fits over the top like this, and then you turn it with the T-handled little tool right here. They sent two guides, or pilots rather, the standard size for new valve guides, and one that's slightly oversized if you're regrinding or cutting seats rather with used valve guides. I had new valve guides, so I used the standard size, and it fit together just perfectly. And that really worked really well. I had no problems cutting the valve seats. It did exactly, I won't go into all the technical details of how to do it. It's fairly involved. That could be a series of 1 or 2 videos alone talking through that. But I'd never done it this way before. I have not even ground valve seats this at all in many, many years. I've lapped a lot of valves, but I haven't cut any valve seats in decades. Back when I was trained in the early 70s, and even then it was done on a powered machine. But it worked really well. I'm glad I went this route. It cleaned up the valve seats, made them look really, really nice. And then even though they say in the booklet you don't have to do this, I did lap in the new valves just so I could see where the valve was seating against the seat, and got them all where I wanted them, and I'm real happy the way it turned out. Again, a little expensive, but while I was doing it, I thought I'm not going to try to take the cheap way out and buy some inexpensive cutter made in the land of close enough. I wanted something that was precision and had a good reputation. I talked to a person on the phone, believe it or not, and they knew exactly what I was after when I said I have a Ford 8N. They said, oh, you need kit number whatever, and they had it to me the next day. I'm very happy the way it turned out, though I did pay for it, frankly. So that's how I cut the new valve seats. And again, that conversation could be a whole series of videos of how to do that properly. If you really wanted to do a quality video series, it could be done. There are videos on YouTube, by the way, about how to cut valve seats, not only for tractors, different tractors, because you can get these kits for all different models, all different versions of engines, and small block Chevys, small block Fords, all different iterations, Japanese engines, and so all kinds of videos out there on how to use these kits. And it's pretty much the same process regardless of the engine you're working on. Here's the cylinder head all reconditioned. You can see I painted it. It's been actually painted for like probably at least a week now at this point, maybe even 10 days. But paint's good and dry. I hand painted it. I did not spray it. I just brushed it on with a good quality brush. And here's the underside, right there. Get this in the shot for you right there. I think you can see it. And all cleaned up, all decarboned. Got a little, looks like a little residue from my tape right here, because I taped this off obviously when I painted it. But you can see it's been cleaned up really, really well compared to where it was when we started. I think it's pretty flat. I didn't put a lot of effort into trying to determine flatness, but that's a very heavy casting. It's cast iron, of course. Many of these holes are for the water jacket to allow water to pass between the head and the block. The through holes, of course, are the head bolt holes. The head bolts are painted also. They're around here somewhere, but they're painted and ready to go back on the engine as well. But many of these holes are water passages. So I did flush the head thoroughly. I cleaned it a number of times. I put evaporust. I sealed it, which was quite an undertaking to seal all those holes so it didn't leak. I sealed it and used evaporust and flushed out thoroughly with warm water under pressure. And because I have hot water in my shop here, so I could do that even though it's wintertime out. And I really cleaned it out really well before I painted it, of course, and so I had that all done. And then the right here, the spark plug holes, I ran a chase through them, make sure they were good and clean, and they're all intact. So the head The head bolts are ready to go back on the engine whenever I get to that point after I finish working on the governor, which again will be a subject of another video. I'm right kind of in the middle of that right now, talking about the governor and some work I'm doing on that. But I could probably have the engine running from this point. Well, now that I got the governor off, it wouldn't be quite this quick. But if the governor was back on the machine, I could probably have this tractor running within an hour or so. One other thing I want to share with you real quick. One of the things I encountered when I was doing the valve job is I had to be able to turn the engine over to bring each cylinder to the top dead center so I could set the valve lash. And of course you can do that by bumping the starter and spinning the engine, and it's fairly imprecise because you overshoot it and then you have to go back around and etc. So what I came up with was this little system here that you can see on the PTO shaft. And that little unit there is an adapter to convert, and it came with a tractor, by the way. It was on the machine when I bought it. It's to convert the 1 1/8 inch output PTO shaft to 1 3/8, which is more modern. 1 1/8 was common when this tractor was new. Subsequent to that, they've gone to a 1 3/8, which is common today, and they also put a groove in it so that it latches and locks in place. So that's just an adapter, that's all it is. And I had taken it off when I was working on the PTO some time ago. Well, what I ended up doing is thinking, well, I want to be able to turn the engine over and without using the starter, so I thought, oh, let me see if this will work. So I put the adapter back on, as you can see. I'll lock that large vice grip or mole grip on there, so I had some leverage to be able to spin it over. Then I just put the PTO, engaged the PTO, left the transmission in neutral, and by engaging the PTO, what I could do is actually turn over the engine. So it's just a simple matter of spinning this, and by doing so, the engine is turning over at the same time, and I can position the pistons much more precisely. If I had help, like my wife or someone out here, and they could watch the pistons, it'd be even easier, but I just turn it a little bit at a time. And in fact, if I crane my neck just right when I do it, I can see where the pistons are at, and it's really easy to manage, and I feel better about using this system than bumping it with the starter. So that's going to be it for this video today, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.